Welcome back, everyone, and if you're new here, I'm so glad you found the channel. We're on an exciting journey to reach 10k subscribers by next year, and every like, comment and subscription brings us one step closer. Your support means everything. Now, let's jump into today's video. The attic had always been forbidden. My father made that clear from the day we moved into this old Victorian house on the outskirts of Houston. Even now, at 21 years old, I could hear his stern voice echoing in my memories. The attic is strictly off limits, Ethan. No exceptions. But fathers aren't supposed to keep secrets from their children, are they? Especially not the kind that make them wake up screaming in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat, muttering about things watching us from the dark. My name is Ethan Parker, and my father, Gregory Parker, used to be one of NASA's top scientists. Used to be, until something happened 5 years ago that changed him forever. The day he came home from work, his face ashen and hands trembling, was the last day he ever set foot in the Space Center. He retired immediately, citing personal reasons, but I knew better. Something had broken him that day. The changes were subtle at first. He started covering all the windows with thick curtains at night, claiming it was to save on energy costs. Then came the salt lines at every doorway and windowsill. Just an old family tradition, he'd say with a forced smile. But it was the nights that truly revealed his deterioration. I'd often find him in his study at 3 a.m, surrounded by old newspapers and scientific journals, his eyes wild and unfocused as he muttered about them and the signal. My sister Samantha tried to convince me to leave it alone. Dad's been through a lot, she'd say, her artistic hands smudged with charcoal from her latest drawing. Some things are better left buried. But Samantha hadn't seen what I had. She hadn't noticed how Dad would stare at the night sky with a mixture of terror and resignation, or how he'd flinch at any mention of space exploration. It was a stormy Friday afternoon when curiosity finally got the better of me. Dad was at his monthly psychiatric appointment, the only time he ever left the house anymore, and Samantha was at her art class. The house creaked and groaned under the assault of wind and rain, almost as if it were trying to warn me away from what I was about to discover. The attic door was locked, of course, but I'd learned a thing or two about locks over the years. The old brass key I'd carefully copied from Dad's keyring slid into the lock with satisfying precision. The door opened with a protesting groan, releasing a wave of stale, musty air. The attic was surprisingly organized for a forbidden space. Boxes lined the walls in neat rows, each labeled with precise dates and categories. But it was the heavy oak desk in the corner that drew my attention. It stood like a sentinel, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust, except for one clear spot, evidence of recent use. The desk drawers were all locked, but the second one had scratch marks around the keyhole, signs of frequent access. It took several attempts, with different picks before the lock finally yielded. Inside, buried beneath stacks of old NASA documents, was a USB drive sealed in a plastic bag. The label made my blood run cold. Project Archangel. Final warning. I almost missed the note tucked beneath it, written in my father's increasingly unstable handwriting. If found, destroy immediately. Do not access contents. They are listening. They are always listening. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the attic through its single circular window. In that brief moment of harsh light, I could have sworn I saw something move in the corner of my eye, a shadow that didn't quite match the objects casting it. My hands trembled as I pocketed the USB drive. Part of me wanted to heed the warning, to destroy it right then and there. But the larger part, the part that had watched my father's descent into paranoia, needed answers. I carefully relocked the drawer and made my way back downstairs, trying to ignore the feeling that the shadows were moving differently now, as if they were watching my every move. The USB drive felt heavy in my pocket, like a lead weight pulling me towards something I couldn't yet understand. In my room, I hesitated before plugging the drive into my laptop. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against my windows with renewed fury. As I inserted the USB, the lights in my room flickered briefly and my laptop screen dimmed for a moment before brightening again. The drive contained dozens of folders, most with names that looked like random strings of characters, but one folder stood out: First Contact. Inside was a video file dated 5 years ago, the same day my father had come home and never returned to work. My cursor hovered over the file as thunder rolled overhead. In that moment of hesitation, I could have closed the laptop, destroyed the drive, and walked away. I could have respected my father's warning and left the past buried where it belonged. Instead, I clicked play. The footage was grainy, obviously from a helmet-mounted camera. It showed a group of astronauts moving across what I initially thought was the lunar surface. But something was wrong. The horizon didn't look quite right, and in the distance, strange structures broke the monotony of the landscape. "Captain Harris, are you getting these readings?" A voice crackled through the static. "Affirmative," replied another voice, tense with barely controlled panic. "These energy signatures, they're unlike anything we've ever seen. Mission Control, are you seeing this?" The camera panned to reveal something that made my heart stop. Rising from the alien landscape was a massive black monolith, its surface so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. As the camera moved closer, a low humming became audible through the recording, growing in intensity with each step. "The signal," whispered my father's voice from off-camera. "It matches the signal we've been receiving. This is it. This is the source." What happened next sent ice through my veins. As the astronauts approached the monolith, their shadows began to move independently, stretching and twisting in impossible ways. The humming grew louder, and one by one, the astronauts began to scream. The last frame of the video showed something emerging from behind the monolith, a figure that seemed to be made of living darkness, with no discernible features except for a void where its face should have been. The video ended abruptly, but my laptop continued to emit a low hum, similar to the one from the recording. As I reached to disconnect the USB drive, movement caught my eye. My own shadow on the wall seemed to ripple just for a moment, as if something was moving beneath it. The sound of a car door slamming snapped me back to reality. Dad was home early. In my haste to close the laptop, I knocked over a glass of water, sending it crashing to the floor. But as I bent to clean up the shards, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The water wasn't reflecting my face. Instead, in its scattered puddles, I saw the same dark figure from the video, watching me from countless liquid mirrors. I had opened something that was never meant to be opened, and now, as I sit here writing this, I can hear my father pacing in his study below, his footsteps growing more frantic by the minute. Samantha just texted to say she's feeling ill and needs to come home early. And the shadows are definitely moving now. This is just the beginning of my story. I know I should stop here, destroy the drive, and try to forget what I've seen. But there are more files to explore, more truths to uncover. And something tells me that it's already too late to turn back. They know I've seen them, and I think they're coming. I didn't sleep that night, how could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that faceless figure from the video. The humming never stopped either, a low, persistent drone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. By morning, I wasn't sure if I was actually hearing it, or if it had taken up permanent residence in my mind. Samantha's condition worsened overnight. Her skin was pale and clammy, and dark circles had formed under her eyes. "I keep seeing things in my dreams, Ethan," she whispered when I checked on her. "A black tower against stars I don't recognize, and something watching from behind it, always watching. I hadn't told her about the USB drive yet, but somehow she was seeing the same things I had seen in the video. The knowledge made my stomach churn. Dad was different too. He knew something had changed in the house. I could see it in the way he moved, cautious, like a hunted animal. That morning, he spent 3 hours checking and reinforcing the salt lines around every window and door. His hands shook as he worked, and I caught him mumbling what sounded like prayers in Latin. I needed to know more. While Dad was occupied with his rituals, I returned to my laptop and the dreaded USB drive. The next folder was labelled Transmission Logs. Inside were hundreds of audio files, each time-stamped and categorised. I clicked on the earliest one. Static filled my headphones, but beneath it, I could make out voices. The NASA communications team speaking in clipped, professional tones. They were tracking something, a signal from deep space that didn't match any known pattern. As I listened to file after file, the story began to unfold. The signal had first been detected 15 years ago, but it was too weak to analyse. Then, 5 years ago, it suddenly intensified. That's when NASA launched Project Archangel, a covert mission to investigate what they believed was first contact with an alien intelligence. But it wasn't first contact. According to my father's notes scattered throughout the files, the signal was a warning. The aliens, the Watchers, as the documents called them, had been here before. They'd left their monoliths across our solar system as beacons, waiting for humanity to advance enough to find them. A knock at my door made me jump. It was Detective Rachel Monroe, an old family friend and one of the few people who still visited us. She looked concerned. "Your father called me," she said, studying my face carefully. "He's worried about you and Samantha. Says you've both been acting strangely." I almost told her everything right then. Rachel had always been the rational one, the voice of reason in our increasingly chaotic lives. But as I opened my mouth to speak, I noticed something that made the words die in my throat. Her shadow on the wall behind her was moving independently, writhing like smoke in a way that had nothing to do with her actual movements. "We're fine," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just a bit under the weather." Rachel didn't believe me. I could see it in her eyes. But before she could press further, a scream echoed through the house. Samantha's scream. We found her in the bathroom, pressed into the corner, her eyes wide with terror. The mirror had shattered, its fragments scattered across the floor. Each shard reflected something different, not the bathroom, not our faces, but snippets of that alien landscape from the video. "They're coming through," Samantha whimpered, pointing at the broken mirror. "They're using every reflection, every shadow. The monoliths were never beacons, Ethan. They were doors." Rachel looked from Samantha to me, her professional skepticism warring with what she was seeing with her own eyes. In the mirror fragments, dark shapes began to move, like living ink spreading across glass. Dad appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of resignation and fear. "You accessed the drive, didn't you?" he asked quietly. "Now they know. They know we remember them." The humming grew louder, and the shadows in the bathroom began to lengthen and twist. Rachel drew her service weapon, though what she planned to shoot at, I couldn't guess. The darkness itself seemed to be coming alive around us. The Watchers weren't just observing us, Dad continued, his voice cracking. They were waiting for someone to understand their message, to activate their doorways. I thought I'd buried it deep enough, hidden the truth where no one would find it. But they knew someone would be curious enough, brave enough, or foolish enough to look. The lights in the bathroom flickered and died. In the darkness I could hear something moving, something that made sounds no earthly creature should make. When the lights came back on a second later, Rachel's shadow was gone completely, though she still stood among us. "Gregory," Rachel said, her voice tight with controlled fear, "I think it's time you told them everything about Project Archangel, about what really happened on the moon, about what you found out there." Dad slumped against the doorframe, suddenly looking every one of his years and more. "It wasn't the moon," he whispered. "What you saw in that video. We were never on the moon. We found the first monolith on Mars, buried in Valles Marineris. NASA kept it quiet, decades of secret missions, preparing for the day we'd find something. But we weren't ready. We could never have been ready." The humming reached a fever pitch, and the remaining lights began to strobe. In each flash, I caught glimpses of movement in the mirror shards. Tall, dark figures drawing closer, their featureless faces turned toward us with an attention I could feel like ice water down my spine. "They showed me things," Dad continued, his eyes unfocused, lost in memories he'd tried to bury. "When we activated the monolith, they showed me visions, the past, the future, what they did to the civilizations that came before us, what they're going to do to..." The lights went out again, plunging us into total darkness. This time, when they came back on, everything had changed. The bathroom walls were covered in what looked like black ice, reflecting not our world, but someplace else. A vast, dark landscape dotted with monoliths that stretched to an alien horizon. And in every reflection, the watchers were moving closer. The bathroom mirrors weren't the only reflective surfaces changing in our house. Every window, every screen, every polished surface became a window into that alien landscape. The Watcher's realm was bleeding into ours, and we were powerless to stop it. Samantha's condition deteriorated rapidly. Dark veins spread across her skin, like ink through water, pulsing in rhythm with the ever-present humming. She spoke in her sleep now, describing vast cities built from shadow and light, structures that defied physics and sanity alike. Sometimes she spoke in languages that had never existed on Earth. "We need to destroy the USB drive," Rachel insisted, her practical nature still fighting against the horror unfolding around us. Her shadowless form created an unsettling void in the light, a reminder that we were already changing in ways we couldn't understand. But Dad shook his head. "It's too late for that. The drive was just a key. They're already here now. They've always been here, waiting in the spaces between spaces, in the shadows we refused to look at too closely." He led us to his study, moving with the urgency of a man who knew time was running out. The room had changed since I'd last seen it. The walls were covered in papers, photos, and sticky notes, all connected by red strings that formed complex patterns. At the center was a large map of the solar system, with locations marked in my father's frantic handwriting. "The monoliths were never just on Mars," he explained, his fingers tracing lines between the marked points. "We found them on Europa, buried in the ice, on Titan, standing like sentinels in the methane seas, even in the Oort cloud, waiting in the darkness between the stars, each one connected to the others, forming a network we didn't understand until it was too late." A loud crash from upstairs interrupted him. Samantha was screaming again, but this time her voice didn't sound entirely human. Rachel drew her gun once more and headed for the stairs, while I followed close behind. We found my sister floating 3 feet above her bed, her eyes completely black. The shadows in her room had taken on three-dimensional form, swirling around her like a dark tornado. Through the window behind her, I could see the monolith from the video standing in our backyard, its surface reflecting nothing, absorbing all light that touched it. "The signal," Samantha spoke, but it wasn't her voice anymore. "The signal was never meant to be a warning. It was a dinner bell." Her body contorted suddenly, bending in ways that should have broken every bone. Rachel fired her gun on instinct, but the bullets passed through Samantha's form, as if she were made of smoke. The shadows caught the bullets and consumed them, adding their mass to the growing darkness. "Gregory!" Rachel shouted downstairs. "We need the rest of the files. There has to be something about how to stop this." Dad's response was cut off by a sound that made my soul freeze. a wet, slithering noise coming from the walls themselves. The wallpaper bulged outward as if something was moving behind it, following patterns that formed and dissolved like living fractals. I ran back to the study, my feet barely touching the stairs. Dad was at his computer, frantically searching through more files from Project Archangel. His hands flew over the keyboard as windows of text and images flashed across the screen. There was a protocol, he muttered, not looking up. For if they ever broke through, NASA knew this might happen. They had to have planned. The computer screen flickered, and for a moment, I saw something reflected in it. A face that wasn't a face. A form that hurt to look at. Dad saw it too. He recoiled from the desk, but not fast enough. A hand made of darkness reached through the screen and grabbed his wrist. Where it touched him, his skin began to turn black, like frostbite spreading at impossible speed. Dad screamed, a sound of pure agony that I'll never forget. Rachel burst into the room and, in a move born of desperate instinct, smashed the computer monitor with the butt of her gun. The hand dissipated like smoke, but the damage was done. Dad's entire arm was now a void, a piece of living darkness that pulsed with otherworldly energy. "The files," he gasped, clutching his transformed arm. On the drive, the last folder, Project Archangel wasn't just about finding them, it was about sealing them away. But the price... He doubled over in pain as the blackness continued to spread. I grabbed the USB drive and plugged it into my phone, the only screen we had left. The final folder was heavily encrypted, but Dad's trembling right hand typed in a password. Lightbringer. The files revealed Project Archangel's true purpose. The monoliths weren't just doorways. They were anchors, points where our reality connected to theirs. NASA had discovered that the Watchers couldn't fully enter our world without these connection points. But destroying the monoliths required a sacrifice, a human consciousness to act as a barrier between worlds. "That's why I sealed away the drive," Dad said, his voice growing weaker as the void consumed more of him. "I couldn't let anyone else make that choice, but now..." He looked at his darkened arm, then at Samantha still floating upstairs, and finally at me. "Now there's no other way." The humming grew to a deafening roar. Through the study window, I could see more monoliths appearing across the neighborhood, each one a tear in reality. The sky above had turned into a writhing mass of shadows, and in the distance people were screaming as their own reflections turned against them. Rachel's shadowless form flickered like a bad transmission. "Whatever we're going to do," she said, "we need to do it now. This isn't just about us anymore. They're spreading." Dad stood up straight, seeming to gather his remaining strength. "The protocol requires a willing sacrifice at the primary anchor point. Someone to give themselves to the void, to become the seal between worlds." He looked at his transformed arm. "I'm already halfway there." "Dad, no," I started to say, but he cut me off. "Ethan, listen carefully. Once I'm gone, you'll need to finish the sequence. The monolith in our backyard, it's the primary anchor. The others are just echoes. Get me there, and I can end this." A thunderous crack split the air. Upstairs, Samantha's levitating form began to glow with an inner darkness, if such a thing were possible. The shadows around her had become so dense they seemed to have weight, pulling pictures from walls and dragging furniture toward her like a gravitational force. "We're running out of time," Rachel said, her voice distorting slightly. Without her shadow, she seemed less solid with each passing minute, as if she too might fade into the growing darkness. "Gregory, what do you need us to do?" The drive's final files contained detailed instructions. A ritual of sorts, but one based on scientific principles so advanced they seemed like magic. Dad explained it as we moved through the house, avoiding the writhing shadows that reached for us from every corner. We needed 5 specific points around the monolith, marked with objects from the original NASA mission. Dad had kept them all these years, hidden in a lead-lined box beneath the floorboards of his room. They looked like simple rocks, but each one hummed with the same frequency as the monoliths, creating a pattern that could momentarily stabilize the breach between worlds. Getting to the backyard was like navigating a nightmare. The house had become a maze of shifting shadows and distorted reflections. Walls rippled like water, and doors opened onto impossible spaces. Twice we had to backtrack when corridors stretched into infinity, and once we found ourselves walking on the ceiling, gravity shifting without warning. Samantha's transformed state had begun affecting the entire upper floor of the house. Dark liquid that looked like oil, but moved like it was alive, dripped upward from the floors, collecting on the ceiling in pools that reflected alien constellations. Her voice echoed through the halls, speaking in overlapping layers, English, Latin, and other languages that hurt our ears to hear. When we finally reached the back door, we found the yard transformed. The monolith dominated everything, its black surface somehow darker than the night sky above. The grass around it had turned grey and brittle, as if all life had been leached away. And the shadows, they moved like living things, forming and dissolving into shapes that the human mind wasn't meant to comprehend. "Remember," Dad said, his voice strained as the void continued to spread across his chest. "The rocks need to form a perfect pentagon around the monolith. Once they're in place, I can complete the circuit." Rachel took 2 of the rocks, and I took 2, leaving Dad with the final one. We stepped into the yard carefully, watching for any sudden movements from the living darkness around us. The humming was so loud now, it made my teeth vibrate and my vision blur. As we placed the rocks, each one sank slightly into the ground and began to pulse with a pale light, the only real light left in a world that seemed increasingly composed of various depths of shadow. When the 4th rock was in position, the monolith's surface began to ripple. That's when the Watchers made their final push. The air itself seemed to tear open, revealing glimpses of their realm, a place of endless darkness and twisted geometry. Figures emerged, their bodies composed of shifting shadows and negative space. They moved with a terrible grace, flowing across the yard like living ink. Dad stumbled, nearly dropping the final rock as the void spread across his face. "Ethan," he gasped, "you need to know. The USB drive. There's one last file. A warning for others. But opening it will..." A tendril of pure darkness whipped through the air, wrapping around Rachel's arm. Where it touched her shadowless form, reality itself seemed to glitch, like a corrupted video. She screamed, but the sound came from everywhere and nowhere at once. More tendrils emerged from the monolith, reaching for all of us. The Watchers were no longer content to simply observe. They were trying to drag us into their realm. Above us, the sky had completely vanished, replaced by a writhing mass of shadows and half-formed shapes that defied description. Samantha's voice boomed from the house, but it had multiplied into a chorus of different tones and timbres. "The door is open, the void hungers, all will be consumed." Dad forced himself forward, fighting against the transformation that had claimed most of his body. The final rock seemed to burn in his remaining human hand. "Remember what they showed me," he said, his voice barely recognizable. "Remember what they did to the others. This can't happen again." With his last human strength, he slammed the final rock into position. The pentagon completed, and a beam of impossibly dark light shot from each rock towards the monolith. Dad turned to me one last time, his face now more void than human, and smiled. "I love you both," he said. "Now run." He stepped into the pentagon, spreading his arms wide. The void that had consumed him seemed to resonate with the monolith, creating a feedback loop of darkness and energy. Reality itself began to bend around him as he walked toward the black surface. "Dad, wait!" I screamed, but Rachel held me back. "We have to go," she said, her form flickering. more rapidly now. We have to survive to tell the story, to warn others. As we ran, I looked back one last time. Dad had reached the monolith, and as he touched its surface, both he and the structure began to collapse in on themselves, pulling the surrounding darkness with them like a black hole consuming light. The other monoliths we could see across the neighborhood started to fracture and implode. The watchers screamed, a sound that existed more in our minds than in our ears, as they were pulled back through the closing breaches. Their realm was being sealed off, with my father as the lock between worlds. We barely made it back inside the house. Through the windows we watched as the monolith, the pentagon of rocks, and the swirling shadows were compressed into a single point of darkness that hung in the air for a moment before vanishing with a sound like thunder. The humming stopped, the shadows returned to normal, and upstairs we heard Samantha collapse. The aftermath was almost worse than the horror itself. The silence felt wrong after the constant humming, like a missing limb that still aches. We found Samantha unconscious in her room, the dark veins gone from her skin, but her hair had turned completely white. The doctors would later call it stress-induced canities, but we knew better. She had seen things no human was meant to see, and her body had marked the trauma in its own way. Rachel's shadow gradually returned over the next few days, fading back into existence like a Polaroid developing in reverse. But it wasn't quite right anymore. Sometimes when she thought no one was looking, I'd catch her staring at it as it moved slightly out of sync with her body, performing actions she hadn't taken yet. The official story was that a gas leak had caused mass hallucinations in our neighborhood. The authorities had a practiced efficiency in explaining away the inexplicable. Several NASA officials in dark suits visited our house, took statements and left us with stern warnings about national security. They didn't need to elaborate on the consequences of speaking out. The haunted look in their eyes told me they knew exactly what we'd experienced. But they didn't find the USB drive. I kept it, though every instinct screamed at me to destroy it. Dad's last words about that final file haunted me. 2 weeks after that night, when I finally worked up the courage to look, I understood why he'd been so afraid. The file wasn't just a warning. It was a record of every civilization the Watchers had encountered. Humanity wasn't their first target, not by far. The file contained images that I still can't fully process. Cities made of crystal and light. Worlds of impossible colors. Beings of pure energy. All of them found. All of them watched. All of them eventually consumed. But it was the last part of the file that truly broke me. It wasn't just a document, it was a program running constantly in the background of every system it touched. Each time someone accessed the drive, it sent out a signal, a beacon, a dinner bell. The Watchers couldn't be destroyed, only contained. What my father did that night, sacrificing himself to seal the breach, it was temporary. The more I study the files, the more I understand the horrible truth. These events repeat in cycles, different locations, different people, but always the same pattern. The Watchers find a way through. Someone sacrifices themselves to seal the breach, and the knowledge gets passed on to the next person who's brave or foolish enough to look too deeply into the dark. I've tried to destroy the drive multiple times. I've burned it, crushed it, even tried to dissolve it in acid. But it always reappears on my desk the next morning, pristine and waiting. The files inside change slightly each time I check them. New details, new horrors, new warnings. Sometimes I find notes from others who've held it before me, spanning decades, all sharing the same desperate warning. Don't look too deep. Don't try to understand, just pass it on and pray. Samantha is getting better slowly. She still draws obsessively, filling sketchbooks with images of the monoliths and shadowy figures that she claims not to remember drawing. Rachel visits when she can, but the disconnect between her actions and her shadow's movements has gotten worse. Last week, her shadow waved goodbye 5 minutes before she actually left. As for me, I know my role now. I'm the keeper of this cursed knowledge, guardian of a truth too dangerous to destroy, but too important to forget. The USB drive sits on my desk as I write this, its small LED light pulsing in a rhythm that, if you listen too long, starts to sound like words. I know what you're thinking. If the drive is so dangerous, why am I sharing this story? Why risk someone else finding it? The answer is in the files themselves. The story has to be told. The warning has to be passed on. Because they're still out there waiting in the spaces between spaces, watching from the corners of our vision. The cycle continues. The USB drive will find its way to someone else, just as it found its way to me. And when it does, another family will face the same choice my father faced. Another sacrifice will be made. Another seal will be created. But maybe, just maybe, if enough people know the truth, someone will find a permanent solution. Someone will discover what my father and countless others before him could not. A way to close the door forever. Until then, I watch the shadows carefully and avoid looking too long at my own reflection. The humming has started again, very faintly. Sometimes late at night, I swear I can hear my father's voice in it, trying to warn me about something new stirring in the void. And the USB drive sits on my desk, waiting. If you're reading this, it means you're part of the story now. You might even find the drive someday, hidden in a departed relative's desk or buried in some forgotten archive. When you do, remember my warning. Curiosity has a price. Some truths are meant to stay hidden. Some doors are meant to stay closed. But if you're like me, you'll look anyway. You'll tell yourself you're strong enough, smart enough, prepared enough to handle what you find. And when you do, when the humming starts and the shadows begin to move, remember this. They're already watching you read these words. In fact, they've been watching all along. And now they know you know.